We're here, we're talking about it, we're talking about our failures, we're talking about our successes in the hopes that somebody else can build on that and do a better job. And then we in turn can learn from them.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, and this week I'm joined by Jay Fox. How you doing, Jay?
Fantastic. I'm relocated from Asheville to West Asheville, so now I'm on the side of the river.
Not a big climate change there.
No, about 3 miles.
Yeah. Well, good to have you with us, bringing us a great interview, which I'm excited to get into. And also got Zach with us this week. How are you going, Zach?
I'm doing great. My home team, the Seattle Seahawks, just won the Super Bowl and now have been referred to as the world champions of American football, which I think is an interesting construct. But it was actually really exciting to watch them win against the Patriots. So I had my sports weekend.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, let's get into this week's podcast. We've got a great interview with a couple of fairly familiar faces or voices to a lot of our audience from Dattner Architects, and involved with some really, really cool stuff. As always, really interesting to hear what's going on around New York City and hearing about the opportunities and challenges as the building code there continues to change and get closer and closer to Passive House. It brings up some interesting design considerations for projects. But before we get into that, we've got a few people to thank, Zach.
We do indeed. So a big thank you to Partel for being our sponsor of the week this week and making everything that we do at Passive House Accelerator possible, including the Passive House podcast. Thank you also to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And thanks to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, LG Air Conditioning Technologies, Proseco, and Source 2050.
Well, with that, let's get into this week's interview. A great conversation that Jay had with Shefali Sanghvi and Heather McKinstry of Dattner.
Hello and welcome to the Passive House podcast. I am your co-host, Jay Fox. I'm here today with Heather McKinstry, Senior Associate and Studio Director at Dattner Architects, and also from Dattner, Shefali Sanghvi. Folks may know her. She's regularly co-host with the Accelerator and a bunch of our programming. She is a Director of Sustainability and Associate Principal at Dattner. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. So just to jump right in, for those who aren't familiar with Dattner, with the firm, could you just give me some background information and the roles that you each play there?
Yeah, sure. So Dattner Architects is an architecture firm that's based in New York City, and most of our work is in like the New York City metro region. We do a lot of civic work, right? Work that you interact with every day, you live in it, you work in it, you use it to get from point A to point B. So we do a lot of multifamily housing, which is, I think, really where the connection with Passive House Accelerator is really reinforced. Most of it is affordable. And also most of it is Passive House now, which is really kind of fantastic. We do transportation and infrastructure projects, so work with MTA, Port Authority, and sort of like the things that keep the city running with DSNY, et cetera. And then we do education, healthcare, and sort of institutional work. So we really believe like our firm has the strong civic mission, and it's one of the reasons that I really wanted to work there. And so for me personally, my background is in affordable housing. I think if people have heard me speak with Passive House Accelerator before, they've heard me say that.
Mhm.
And I really was excited to work at Dattner because I felt like we had that shared mission. And I was able to really focus my efforts in sustainability and how our projects can be the most sustainable version of themselves. And in our housing studio, it was pretty simple because Passive House really made that a very accessible thing. And now I really focus my time on the other typologies that we work on to ensure that we are really, in absence of a third party certification or some policy that might be pushing us a certain way, that our projects are really looking forward to what's coming and how we're addressing the impact of the built environment to climate change.
Wow,
Heather?
that is great.
Sure. So I'm one of the studio directors for our housing studio. So I'm very focused on housing. And at Dattner, we have a lot of expertise in a really specific typology of housing, which is we do mostly new construction. We have some kind of renovation and adaptive reuse work, but it's mostly new construction and pretty large scale. So we really focus in on between, 150 to 400 unit apartment buildings. So a pretty large scale building, and that's been really a great fit for Passive House. Like, we see a lot of co-benefits there in these larger apartment buildings. So it's been really great to see that over the last 10 years, we went from, doing some of our first Passive House buildings, 425 Grand Concourse, which was at the time the largest Passive House building in North America, to now really seeing that many of our projects and many of our repeat clients see the benefits of Passive House, and they're making that choice to commit to it early on in projects, and more of our projects are becoming Passive House.
Yes. It's fantastic. One question kind of occurred to me as you were, talking about the scale of these projects. You're in New York, which is a very, very dense area. Where is the space coming from to build these larger projects? Is it like city or state land that's kind of become available for development due to policy changes, or is it like community redevelopment and rejuvenation happening? Like where do you usually get these big plots of land?
Yeah, so there's a variety of things that are happening. One is city-based zoning changes where the city rezones an entire neighborhood, and then we see the benefit of that when sites become more desirable to have, that they are able to support a larger building. We also have a lot of clients who come to us to help them rezone a specific lot or block. So we're working on upzoning. We go to the city with all the reasons why, a larger affordable housing project is beneficial to a neighborhood. But one of the actually things that reasons why Passive House is so great for our affordable housing is sometimes we end up with sites that are in what might be described as less desirable places,
Mm.
located really close to an elevated train, located close to a highway. And we get kind of additional benefit from Passive House by having a really well sealed envelope, having, really great sound attenuating windows, that those affordable projects that might not be in the, prime locations in New York City are still really great, healthy places to live because we're building to a Passive House standard.
Yeah. No, I remember 425 Grand Concourse in particular. It's just there's like between trains and highways and even flight paths, it's just like one of the noisiest sections of the city is right there in the South Bronx. So it's really great to do Passive House.
Yeah, and a neighborhood that has one of the highest rates of asthma in the country. So obviously the health of the community is of utmost importance.
Yeah.
I
So
think what's kind of interesting about that is that when we first started working on Passive House, like Grand Concourse was our first Passive House project in design. A lot of, we were lucky on that project that the client was pretty savvy and understood what Passive House was, and it didn't take a lot to convince him. It was like a collaborative effort. But in the early, 10 years ago, 10, 11, I don't know, however many, time has no meaning, however many years ago, when we were trying to convince clients to do Passive House, we really emphasized the energy savings and kind of like being able to tie it to a demonstrable ROI. But this impact to tenant health is really been for me personally that was not as aware of it as Heather was when we first started, a really great side effect that it's like we're building affordable housing for people who often don't have choice that other people who just are able to shop the market have. And we're able to provide them a place that is healthy. And that is really great because that's not something that we often like find the money for when we are talking about affordable housing.
Yeah. I've really wanted to explore that more. I work in the mental health field quite a bit, and I've seen that there's like a clear correlation between particulate matter pollution and mental health outcomes, even like years down the road. But we don't have the best data for it yet. But I feel like that's going to be a hopefully a conversation that becomes more common in the next couple of years. All right. Well, I guess we should switch over to our the focus of today's conversation, which is sustainable practices. That's a recent white paper that Dattner just put out, and that's why I reached out to you two. Kim sent it my way, and I was like, "Oh, this is fantastic. We should publicize this so much more." So, I guess it's obviously called sustainable practices, but I guess to set the stage, what's kind of the gist of the paper?
So the Sustainable Practices is the name of a series of white papers that our internal sustainable practice group puts out. So our internal sustainable practice group, or SPG, is really made up of, at this point, like 75% of the office, people who really care about sustainability. We started it when we signed on to the AIA 2030 commitment in 2012. And then in 2018, we really under Heather's leadership, rebranded it to have different areas of focus: energy, renewables, indoor health, materials, psychology, urban infrastructure. And in the intervening time, we realized that we had this ability, we had sort of created this vehicle that gave us the ability to research policy, practice, trends, and see not only how it applied to our direct work, but also to our industry at large. So our first one was on mass timber, and the second one is on affordable housing and passive house.
Mhm.
And so this was really born from kind of like our energy group, really focusing on how reductions in operational carbon and also building on this like great expertise that we have in our housing studio in these large scale multifamily affordable passive house projects. And so the white paper discusses briefly what Passive House is and how it was founded. I think a lot of the same things that you guys cover in your PHA 101 series with your little video at the beginning, but also kind of talks more in depth about how Passive House is well suited for dense urban environments and this kind of like large scale affordable multifamily sector, and then includes case studies for 5 of our completed Passive House projects, which include 425 Grand Concourse, which I think is, like, our most iconic Passive House project, which Heather worked on, and then Vital Brookdale and Alafia, which were done under the Vital Initiative with New York State that really ties health and wellness to affordable housing, Chestnut Commons, and Santea Gardens.
And where the last one you mentioned, where is that? I'm not that's the one I'm least familiar with.
So Santea Gardens was actually our first completed passive house project and was completed during COVID. So like sort of those that tie-in of the impact of passive house to health what became really stark during that project. That one is in the Bronx as well and is located directly adjacent to the elevated train. And that elevated train and the resulting kind of environmental criteria that was attached to the site really gave us the opportunity to push the client to really consider Passive House and then also do it and, like, have it certified and not just do it in name only.
Very cool. And it's funny you bring up COVID because I remember working for the accelerator at the time and talking about indoor air quality and, this virus that's going around and how worried we're about it. And my neighbors liked Yankee candles, like the really, really sweet smelling, horrible Yankee candles. And I'm sitting there smelling it one day, writing about, indoor air quality and, how better filtration can help with health. And I'm like, well, if I'm smelling that, that's a
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, what else are you not smelling?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. All right. Well, cool. I guess speaking to one of the points of the white paper that you kind of brought up, how dense urban areas like New York City are well suited for passive house multifamily buildings. What's kind of I guess, the science behind that folks may not recognize?
Well, I guess I just wanna start by saying, like, I think passive house is great for everyone everywhere because it is climate specific and results driven, but, obviously we work in New York, so we're really focused on why it's great for New York City. We're in a really dense urban environment. People here are used to living in smaller living spaces. That's just kind of a standard that everybody is accustomed to here. But really the big benefit is form factor. When you're in a building where you're in a single family home, you've got at least 4 walls and a roof, right? And in an apartment building, you're sharing walls with neighbors. You very frequently don't have a roof right above you, you have a neighbor above you. You only have kind of 1 or maybe 2 surfaces of envelope directly impacting your living space. So that form factor is really beneficial in Passive House. Obviously, 4 of the principles relate directly to envelope. So our volume to surface area ratio is just really, really beneficial. In what we've seen in our affordable housing is the height of the building actually really impacts what we need to do on that envelope. So in our 6 and 7-story projects, we do need a lot more continuous exterior insulation than in our even 12-story buildings. And then again, it's another step to the 26-story building for 425 Grand Concourse was essentially we were just doing code minimum continuous insulation on the exterior of that building.
I should I should remember that because I wrote about that a while ago. But and I mean, all of these have triple pane windows, right? Or can you get away with double pane in some?
Yeah. So more and more our projects have triple pane windows because in New York City we have requirements around bird friendly glazing now, and that often pushes us a little further towards the triple glazed window. 425 Grand Concourse and some of our other early Fias projects were able to utilize double pane windows. The standards have, gotten a little more stringent over the last couple of years, and we are seeing other requirements coming forth that have pushed us more towards triple glazed on our more recent projects.
Just to add one thing to that is I think what's interesting is that because of the form factor, because this sort of optimized surface area to volume ratio, we were also able to get away with relatively high window wall ratios so that it didn't necessarily feel like just punched windows on a large facade of brick or metal panel. So, our highest ones are about 29 to 32%, which for an affordable housing project for a passive house affordable housing project, it really does provide this access to daylight and makes the rooms feel larger. And I think really increases the quality of life of the people that live in the building.
Yeah, I would just add to that a lot of our affordable housing is block and plank as a structural system, and what we're really limited by is the window size opening for block and plank. It's not a passive house requirement.
That's great because that was a misconception. I think that it's fading away, but that passive house buildings just have very small windows and small ratios. Cool. Well, I guess focusing again more on New York City, like just policy wise, and I think I was leaning into the idea of there being heating. You have to supply heating as an affordable housing provider. Does that make passive house better suited in New York City to affordable housing, or is that not as big of a factor? There's other things in play.
So I think from like the policy code point of view, the heating is not it doesn't really come into play. I think, there's always centralized heating, et cetera. I think what's being discussed right now is access to cooling and making sure that access to cooling is provided. And that is, I think, going to be really interesting for affordable housing in New York City. The vehicles through which that happens is either through New York City Housing Preservation and Development, which is at the city level, or New York State Housing Community and Renewal at the state level. And they both have pretty stringent and aggressive design and sustainability guidelines that require cooling and have required cooling prior to any local council changes or kind of this new upcoming energy code that is coming into play at the city. It's already in place at the state. That requirement for cooling has made this a little easier. So right now, the big difference in New York City between code compliant buildings and passive house buildings is ERVs and making sure that you're providing filtered fresh air to all the units. But that too is going to change when that new energy code comes into play in April. So I think we're really getting to the point where that incremental upcharge from code compliant to passive house is going to continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Last year, the city passed a City of Yes zoning, like a whole zoning overhaul. Some of it was City of Yes for carbon neutrality, and some of that included a 5% net floor area bonus for buildings that demonstrate 15% better than energy code. So they characterize that as ultra low energy buildings. And so for old energy code, it was actually kind of simple to demonstrate a 15% savings because you're like, if I provide less services, I'm using less energy, and there is my 15%.
Yeah.
But I think with this new energy code, we're really going to have to start thinking really aggressively about how can we reduce energy consumption. And a lot of that is what is the thermal performance of our building envelope? And that also supports passive house.
A lot of our clients are nonprofits who also are service providers for the clients who live in the building. And so even in cases where providing access to cooling is not a requirement, they're very keyed into during new construction is the time to make that available. That this is, it's easier now than to provide window air conditioners later or, figure something out later. And particularly in our, climate crisis as nighttime temperatures are increasing. It used to be the solution was that we'd have cooling centers and, seniors and other people could go to a library or community center and sit in a cooling center during the day. But now nighttime temperatures are rising and becoming, impactful to people's health. And so a lot of the developers who also provide services in this building are really keyed into we need to provide cooling. And once we're providing heating and cooling, that connection to an energy efficient envelope is really critical.
You talk about electrification, you talk about heating, you talk about cooling, and then soon we're going to talk about ERV. So it's like, what are we really talking about as an incremental upcharge from code compliant building and passive house? And that's really, I guess, for the market rate sector. But, I think Heather's point is completely correct about the affordable sector or kind of like more mission driven work where it's like, what kind of what kind of spaces are we providing and how long are they going to be able to be efficient in the middle of this kind of climate crisis that we're very actively dealing with?
Yeah. And I guess going back to the code, like, is this applying to, retrofits, or buildings of a certain size? Like, if are you kind of grandfathered in if you're, let's say, a 60,000 square foot building built in like the 1980s, or are they kind of realizing like, yes, everybody needs this to kind of be better equipped to deal with this climate crisis, or not?
We don't do a lot of existing building renovations, so I'm less familiar with that. But I think there is this that ultra low energy building benefit is for new buildings or renovations. So, there was kind of this zone green deduction that we used to have where you could deduct 8 inches of your exterior wall if you were better than code. And that really kind of helped the idea of like overbuilds on renovation. So I think that a lot of those things are still going to be in play. And I'm not entirely sure how new energy code is going to deal with existing buildings and what you touch and what that as a result requires you to do. And I do think that a lot of the existing buildings are also in historical neighborhoods. So what happens when you're dealing with energy code and also dealing with LPC or SHPO? And so it's going to be interesting, but I don't know that we're kind of the best people to speak about that.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I've had to write about a few things where they're like, well, we can't do continuous insulation on the outside because of historical requirements, and even on the we don't want to lose, a bunch of space. So it's difficult, but hopefully, I don't know what the solution will be, but folks are working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like the more interesting part of this would be the adaptive reuse potential for looking at buildings. Like we have so much non-class A office stock, and there's this idea of can office to residential conversions really work? But those buildings, those smaller office buildings may be a better opportunity to do a passive house conversion just because there's so much more space It's not like a bespoke, attached brownstone in a historic district.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point because I used to work in a very old, not very old, I guess it was probably from the 50s maybe, office building, and it was the idea of converting it to residential, like, it's just not the floor plate is just not designed to allow light into the middle, so it's very difficult. How does site EUI of passive house buildings compare to code-built projects that you've seen, and what kind of on-site renewables has Datner used within these projects in the city to reduce source EUI?
Yeah, I mean, Heather and I specifically really love looking at EUI. And, in this case, just to make it clear for everyone, we're talking about predicted EUI. We're not really talking about actual EUI. We're still waiting for some like real data to come in on our completed projects to be able to make that comparison. But we have this slide that we use often and is also in our case study, like images in our case study about kind of national multifamily EUI, New York City multifamily EUI, and then kind of where our passive house projects are. So I'm probably going to say something incorrect, but national in New York City is around 60 or 80. And all of our housing projects, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, are between 9 and like 25. So that's a pretty significant savings, and that's site EUI.
Yeah.
The projects that have really robust renewables associated with them, their source EUI becomes really close to the site EUI. So 425 is our only and will probably be our ever only passive house project with no on-site renewables. Our other projects that have renewables, most of them have a photovoltaic array, and that is really limited by the size of the roof, right? So when we think about these dense urban projects that are taller than they are wider, they're more vertical rather than horizontal. The array, even if they're large, they sound large in terms of kilowatt hours, don't really pick up a lot of the load when you think of it as a percentage of the building's load. Our largest I'm not gonna talk about Alafia right now, but aside from Alafia, our largest PV array in comparison to building load is on Vital Brookdale, where we have a 100 kilowatt array, and there the site and source EUI are very close.
Mhm.
At Alafia, we were really able so this is a master plan project, and it's not a full thermal energy network, but we were really able to provide something very close to a thermal energy network in the sense that we have geothermal, we have wastewater heat recovery, and we have solar arrays. And they're PHI and not FIAS. So they have stricter energy standards and a lot more on-site energy renewable. So there, the EUIs are like 9 to 11. The site EUI and the source EUI is also like 10 to 13. So what I'm finding is that that integration of on-site renewables obviously really cuts down on your energy consumption. And when you're thinking of a very efficient all-electric building, those benefits are quite real. They're very tangible and you can see them in the dots of this chart that we've created.
I guess I just wanna also add to that about how this plays into form factor, right? Like, Vital Brookdale is 6 and 7-story building segments, and so your roof area to energy to EUI is pretty high, like, so we're able to put a lot of PVs per apartment unit, right? Whereas 425 Grand Concourse is a 26-story tower. Because of the way zoning works, we were actually had no rear yard requirement, so we built that entire site and then used a lot of roof area to create outdoor amenity space. So we just really didn't have a lot of PV buildable area left over, and even if we had the ratio of PV to building would have been quite small. We should have put some PV. I wish there were PVs on there, but it is again like we are always looking for this balance or the trade-offs between, a 6 or 7-story building and a tower. Where can you find the benefits and really keying into what's gonna work best for any individual project?
And just to talk again about Vinyl Brookdale, the clarification here is like, yes, it's 6, 7 stories, but it is very long. There's two building segments, and each building segment is over 300 feet long. So here it's a more typical building that we would build on its side. It's like a horizontal skyscraper, not a vertical skyscraper. So I think that's really kind of the missing piece to why that project is unique. we don't get those projects very often. That it's not entirely within our wheelhouse, but it was really interesting to see how that horizontality compared to verticality really impacted where we put our insulation.
Okay. And, I guess I forget what these are called, but basically the PVs that kind of
The BIPV, building
get
integrated
it integrated.
project. Yeah.
Yes, that totally escaped me. Have you explored using those at all on some of these more horizontally oriented buildings, or is just, like, the technology not really there yet?
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think that we will be soon, and, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection is really pushing for green infrastructure to reduce the load on the city's kind of aging storm infrastructure. And so what that means for us is that they want green roofs, and they want green on our roofs and not impeded by PV panels. So we're sort of now even further constrained about where we can put photovoltaic panels. And I think that as that continues to develop, because it's also something that's really necessary, we're going to see potentially more integration of BIPV. Right now, my concerns are kind of efficacy versus cost, and what kind of ROIs are we talking about to make that work? And then, like, are we putting ourselves in an unfortunate position a few years down the line when maintenance needs to happen or something like that? Like, what's the longevity of some of these manufacturers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that that there's been a real change in the conversation around PVs in the last 10 years where it was something we were really pushing for, but getting a lot of pushback about those upfront costs. And it's really hard to make these affordable housing budgets work, for a closing date when they need to, have everything pencil out. But that conversation has really changed. And I think partly because of the savviness of some of these PV installers, and now our clients are really pushing, like, maximize how much PV you can get because there is some, benefit for them that has been worked out, but it is kind of working because it's like a hat on top of our completed building. So I think there's still a missing piece, one, in terms of the efficacy of the vertical panels, but two, if it really is integrated into our building architecture, how does that become part of this, like, almost a little bit separate thing than the architecture that currently it's this separate little scope that happens later in the project.
And I guess so this is a slightly different, but it's another kind of emerging technology, but geothermal in the city, like, have you seen more developers kind of exploring that? I figure if you're doing such a huge building, it makes a bit more financial sense. I know for single family, it's like, I won't say prohibitively expensive, but it gets pretty expensive. Like, are you seeing more interest, or is there just really not the space typically in a city site?
The great thing about ground source is that you can get a lot of benefit, again, vertically, but just you're going vertically downwards. So because of the IRA, there were a lot of incentives for people to develop the ground source, and we had a number of projects that did decide to pursue ground source because of the more uncertain political climate right now. We have fewer clients deciding to pursue that. It is still extremely expensive, and so without the tax incentive, it's something that most affordable projects can't support. But it is also, right, that scale thing. So when we do have a large site, it's easier to do maybe a horizontal ground source installation, and I think it's just like an economy of scale as you're scaling up into some of these bigger projects, and certainly some of our large projects are using ground source. It's super exciting. To me, that is the ideal, heating and cooling source for a passive house building because you're limiting penetrations and you're using a renewable energy source. That's my dream that we can continue to go in that direction. Of course, there are some projects in New York City. I am working on a project in New York City that is directly located over some critical infrastructure. So we looked very briefly at ground source, and then the city said, no way, you cannot possibly put anything this close to critical infrastructure. So yeah, there are some cases where that happens, but that's not a universal problem in the city. There's certainly plenty of sites where I think it would be a great addition to a passive house project.
Because I have I've seen it quite a bit outside of New York City, so, like, Syracuse, the bread factory retrofit going on there. They have, like, this whole random wedge of property that hasn't ever been developed because it's so awkwardly shaped, and they're just putting all of their geothermal there. So it worked out for them, but there's just not properties really like that in the city. So, anyway, that's good to hear that it's not that, like, you don't need that much space and you can actually still do it as long as it's not on top of, like, a subway line or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert at it. I did 2 ground source projects, like, 15 years ago, but what I've heard is, even the site conditions, because we thought, "Oh, you're gonna hit rock," and then what we hear is, "Oh, actually, being in rock is okay." So, there's obviously a lot of different site conditions as you start digging down in New York City, but what we've heard is that, there's a lot of flexibility in the systems, and they can usually do the engineering to make it work. It is just mostly a cost consideration.
Cool. Alright, well, switching gears slightly, you brought up costs, and that makes me Dattner has done a lot of passive house projects and has obviously worked with a lot of clients, and some of our listeners might struggle to get the client to yes on passive house. So, like, what have been some of the misconceptions that you're still seeing about developing the passive house for affordable providers, and how do you get them to how do you persuade them and show them the light, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think because so much of the work that we do is cost driven, cost is always the big thing, right? And when you have a GC on board that has done passive house before, their cost premiums are very different from a GC that has not really done a lot of passive house before. And that gap is a really difficult one to bridge. We've heard 0 to 3%, 3 to 5%, and 10%. That's a big range when you're really talking about large projects where every dollar counts and there's always a little bit of a funding gap and everyone's kind of struggling to make sure that we're saving every dollar per square foot, that even if it's like 50 cents a square foot, that a amounts to something, right? It amounts to real dollars, and, like, there's a trade-off of what are we doing? And so I think that cost misconception is a big one. I like if I'm part of a conversation where the client is like, "Oh, I've heard this," I just like providing alternate perspectives in relation to cost. And then, demonstrating that there is an ROI associated with it. When you are as on this affordable housing project, you are paying for everyone's kind of heating bill. So it does benefit you to put a little bit more money into the facade so that we could right size the heating system in this all expensive to install and expensive to operate all electric heating system. And then I think we work with some clients that are more mission driven and they want to make sure that they're providing a place where the tenants of their building feel really comfortable, they feel safe, they feel secure, and that health is a primary factor for them. And then there we really emphasize the indoor health and well-being benefits of passive house. And the story we kind of like telling is in 2023 when there was the Canadian wildfires and we had to deal with wildfire smoke in New York City, which at that point was completely unheard of, like not something that we had ever factored into the types of climate change that we would have to deal with. We don't have data to support this, but anecdotally, we heard that the the tenants in our passive house buildings were kind of inoculated from all of that dust and dirt and debris because they had filtered fresh air, they had an airtight building, their windows closed and sealed fully. And that is a real benefit, especially because we're dealing with more and more of this as the years go by. I live in a three-story kinda tenement building in New York City. None of my windows close all the way, so it's been really frigid for, like, these last few weeks here, and I had dust everywhere in my apartment even with all of the windows closed.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I think it's for me, it's always been how do you talk to the client where you can demonstrate that there's a shared value between us and them and that this supports their value system? I think the other thing that we get, and this one a little I find a lot more frustrating and I really have to remind myself not to roll my eyes on, is this idea of like, well, why don't we just do it and not pay for certification? Why don't we just say passive house certifiable, right? That was the big thing with LEED 20 years ago, where we were like, we just say LEED certifiable, we'll fill out the checklist, but we won't pay for certification. And, in seriousness, I do understand that the cost of certification is a cost that needs to be borne. But the thing here is that because Passive House is based on building science and trade offs and performance, we really do need that third party verifier to come in to make sure that the contractor is doing what is on our drawings, that our drawings are in support of this like Passive House certification. And we really rely on that to make sure it's happening. And if you're going to pay for that third party verification, which is not something that Dattner will take on, then why not pay for the certification?
Yeah.
It's in your best interest, right? The last thing we want is to have an unforeseen mold condition in an exterior wall because we were saying it'll be Passive House certifiable. And then something happened during construction and there was no one there to be like, hey, wait a second, why are we doing that?
Yeah. No, I could agree more. And yeah, I'm just thinking about in the UK how you had folks go around and just put exterior insulation on everything without really checking the modeling. And now it's a mold problem and people are turned off to continuous insulation on the exterior buildings and it's a nightmare. So yeah, you need that verification. I did want to ask you mentioned price and so or I guess like the premium and so I'm originally from Michigan, and not many passive house buildings have been built in Michigan, and I've heard the premium there is like 10%. Meanwhile, in like Massachusetts and New York, I'm hearing closer. You cited 0 to 3. Just in your time as you've seen more adoption in New York, like have you seen that premium come down, or is it like stubbornly staying around 3%? And like there's other factors at play. It's not just, the industry kind of learning how to do it.
I'll just say that right now, I would say it's about 3%. But I think in a year, it's going to be like point 0 to 1%.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is code is getting more stringent and getting closer to passive house.
Mm.
It is, I think, as Shefali mentioned before, expertise on the part of the contractors. I do think there is a little economy of scale when we work on larger buildings. That difference is smaller than when we work on smaller buildings. I think there's also part of this that it's about the accuracy of the modeling and getting good data from our built projects to understand, are they meeting the predictions that we made in the model, so that clients can understand and pencil in, here's what the actual utility costs are going to be going forward. And part of that, which I wanted to talk about more broadly also, is, part of this is always educating clients so they understand the importance of passive house and why to do it, understanding, why this is important to us and why it should be important to them. But there's also this part of educating the people who live in the building and the people who operate the building, making sure you have a super who knows how all these systems work. And that really helps make sure that everything is running as it was intended and everything is kind of staying on track to meet those predictions that we make when we're in design. But so much of it is about education and, making sure that the people who live here understand how their home works and how it works for them and how they can best support it, continuing to work as efficiently as possible.
And I mean, what kind of like educational materials do you really need to provide? Like, is it, I mean, you don't need to have people come to like have a several 3 hour long seminars on how to like operate your passive house. Like, is it just like, here's a piece of paper, like, don't here, this is what you should do, or is it a bit more involved than that? Like, where, yeah, what is the education process and what does that actually kind of look like?
Currently, the education process is very limited. I mean, we focus a lot of our time and energy on educating clients so that they choose to do this, right? And then part of the challenge of being an architect is like, well, the building is built, the project is done, goodbye. And we really are always thirsty for that knowledge. How did the building perform? How did this work out? Do people like this space? Do people, how is this material holding up? We want that information, but it can be really hard to get. And so, we traditionally don't have a lot of interaction with the people who end up living in the building, but I think that's something that I'm thinking about a lot is, is this about signage? Is it, something really simple? Not obviously every person who lives in a passive house doesn't need to become a, CPHC, but are there ways of understanding that can be done through more like simple interventions in the building itself so that people know, here is what a PTHP is and here's how it's working. And so this is the best way for you to utilize it so that you're comfortable, throughout the day.
Okay.
The only other thing I would add to that is that through HPD, and I'm pretty sure through HCR, part of what we have to do is through like their sustainability criteria or through enterprise green communities, which is a requirement of HPD, is you do have to provide a resident manual, but we are not necessarily part of that process. It's usually from the sustainability consultant. And even though we care deeply about sustainability, we are not the sustainability consultants. We're the architects. And so I think like part of what, to Heather's point of what we're trying to do is see how can we be a little more involved in that and how can we provide signage. I worked on a lead project 20 plus years ago where we felt it was important for the tenants of the building to understand like why there were multiple trash bins. 20 years ago, what we were talking about in sustainability is very different from what we're talking about now. So we created like stickers that we installed, bilingual stickers that we installed behind every apartment door that it just explained some of these things and looked like a cartoon. And so I think part of this is when you're doing this kind of tenant engagement, how are you doing it in a way where it's received, and are you talking to them quite literally in a language they understand?
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And yeah, I guess I just this is my ignorance and not being in a passive house too much, but like what I guess beyond within their unit, is there anything that they need to know and anything that like, as occupants of this building that they need to be familiar with, or is it just like this is how you kind of use your HVAC system when you're in your apartment?
I think that part of what we liked about Passive House is that it doesn't require this degree in building science to live in a passive house building. Some of this is happening behind the scenes or like you're not necessarily aware of it. It's just happening in the background. But, I think Heather can talk to this better than I can. There is this thing that we're dealing with or contending with where people are coming from very inefficient buildings to very efficient buildings and have to recalibrate how they're used to living in their space. I think Heather, you talked about this at your presentation on Wish Fish Lot 26. So I don't know if you want to quickly summarize.
Sure. Most apartments in New York City are heated by giant radiators, and it's a single zone for a 300, unit apartment building or however big your building is. It's one zone and that's heat is on or heat is off. And so people are used to being in an apartment that's 78 degrees all winter, 80, really, really warm all winter. People are used to just having their window open all winter to combat that heat. And so when people move into a passive house and our model says, "Oh, well, people should set their set point at 68 in the winter, and that should be your heating set point." That is not happening, as particularly, like people aren't paying for their heat, so there's no incentive for them to turn the heat down in winter. And they're just acclimated to being, wearing a t-shirt and shorts all winter when they're in their home. So there is just this kind of adjustment period I think that people are going to need and, understanding how this heating system works and, what are the benefits. There's certainly lots of people who complain about how hot their apartment is all winter, so I don't think it's like people necessarily want to be in an 80-degree apartment all winter, but I think a greater understanding of the health benefits of, being at a different temperature and how else you can utilize your apartment, and the fact that even though your window's not open, you are getting fresh air. I think one of the misconceptions we hear a lot is about, like, you can't open the windows in a passive house, and of course, that's something obviously, you can open your window anytime you want, but you don't have to, and that's the real benefit of passive houses. You don't have to open a window if you don't want to, you're still getting filtered fresh air, but it's great to open your window when you wanna feel more connected to nature and get a breeze, but certainly when it's 20 degrees out, your apartment's not so overheated that you are compelled to open a window and get really crazy drafts all over the place.
I lived in a tenement building in Sunset Park, and literally my window was open from October till probably April. It actually was always open just because it was either too hot or too cold, and there was a miserable place, but, yeah, I mean, I hated doing it, but it was just way too uncomfortable to not have that window open. And also the radiator kept me up all night because it hissed like a snake, and it was just freaking miserable. Anyway,
What is that Saturday Night Live skit where they it's like 2 people pretending to rap? First of all, pretending to rap, and then pretending to rap like a radiator, and it's very funny because it is very on point.
I'll have to pull that up. I haven't seen that one. All right. Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So there was one question I definitely wanted to ask, and it's kind of about heating and right sizing mechanicals and how that's kind of getting more difficult. But yeah, so this is about future proofing mechanical systems because New York is switching from heating dominated to cooling dominated if it's not already cooling dominated. And how are you kind of strategizing to right size and kind of future proof your mechanicals for that?
Well, we are already in this dense urban environment where we are cooling load dominated. So we're already sizing our equipment and, scaling our insulation to contend with a cooling load dominated building. Obviously, we're kind of continuing to move in that direction, but the thing about the climate crisis is it's all over the place. It's not just about having more sustained hot temperatures in the summer. We're going to be tomorrow, it's going to be a feels like temperature of -10. So, we really actually need some kind of robust systems in either direction. And I think that's a bit of a challenge. Certainly, as we're moving towards heat pumps, we need heat pumps that can work in low temperatures, particularly like we've now moved to all electric domestic hot water heat pumps and making sure that we're integrating systems that can contend with a wide range of temperatures. But also, we are really cognizant about right sizing. I think historically, mechanical systems have been designed for worst case scenario. And what we have seen through some of our colleagues that are sustainability consultants and have done kind of deeper research into this is that, running something at 70% capacity most of the time just so that it can reach 100% capacity 2 days a year is really inefficient. So kind of downsizing some of that equipment so it's getting closer to, its actual capacity most of the year, and then there might be a couple days where you might need some backup or you're not gonna hit exactly your target temperature, but maybe you can get through with a sweater on those couple days a year, or, maybe there are other things that we need to discuss about the extreme days that we're not accounting, we're not being inefficient every other day of the year because we have a few extreme days a year.
It makes me think of I forget who I was talking with. Somebody was just trying to design a commercial kitchen for Passive House, and, like, it's impossible because you need to be ready to hit this enormous, energy use and then drop down to 0 and then go up to 100 and then go to 0, and it's just, like, massively inefficient and really difficult to do, and way above my pay grade because they were, like, actual mechanical engineers talking about it. That just yeah. Yeah, if you ever wanna feel dumb, talk with Maureen Sanchez about commercial kitchens, and she'll just
She is I she's like my hero. I have heard her talk about that commercial kitchen project, and I'm just like, "Tell me everything. I have so much to learn from you."
I just it was like I just kept, like, writing down words and, like, Google that later, but not in Spot on back, like, you know what you're doing. So, yeah. Alright, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I just wanna close with, I guess, a shout out to developers who are looking into the possibility of developing a passive house building in New York City that's affordable. What recommendations would you have? What kind of state agencies would you point them to, and what type of other organizations? There may be nonprofits or, like, that weird, like, they're kind of state organizations, but also kind of help private sector. Like, what's some of your advice for folks who wanna do the right thing?
Yeah, I think the caveat here is that we can really only talk to affordable
Mm.
passive house. We don't really have a lot of experience in the market rate passive house world, but on the affordable side, HPD and HCR have like term sheets for passive house projects where you're able to my understanding, and I'm not a finance person, nor do I have a finance background, but my understanding is you're able to sort of underwrite to some of these anticipated savings, which is something. But really, I think NYSERDA is the vehicle where there is still some funding available. Some of it is competitive, like the Buildings of Excellence program or Future Housing Initiative. but also they do have like the ability if you're doing like I think they still have a ground source heat pump grant and thermal energy network grants. And so I think depending on the type of project you're doing, there is, although that window is closing, there are there are still some opportunities at the state level to be able to do stuff like this. It is We were really excited about the IRA funding and how that was a really great vehicle to do some of these more energy efficient or deeper energy saving, I don't know, systems interventions, whatever you want to call them. But as we all know, that is no longer an option for us.
Yeah. There was I mean, if a project's kinda underway, I forget where I was. I think I was at a NESE conference, and they were talking about certain types of infrastructure within a building for heat pumps was still like you could get some type of tax rebate. Is that still ongoing, or has that been cut as of, like, this year?
Honestly, we don't know because we don't have that finance background, but from what we're hearing about newer projects coming down the pipeline or trying to close in the next couple of closing cycles, it's no longer something folks are relying on.
Wait, can I just say something more uplifting?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Because yes, oh, tough reality. But for people who are looking to do this, there are ways of doing it, certainly in affordable housing in New York City. And I know a lot of developers are very conservative. They're taking a huge financial risk. And so, they want to make sure they're getting a product that's meeting their needs and is, financially sound. I think the great thing is like it's proven in New York City that you can do this. So go talk to developers who have done it. Go see some projects, take a tour. My advice would be work with at least one person who has done passive house before. So like, I mean, come work with us, but if your architect has not done passive house, make sure you have a contractor who has done passive house. Somebody on the team needs to be expert to really help make sure you're hitting those goals. That there are just some lessons learned as you're going through the process, and I think having someone on the team who's an expert at this is really gonna benefit a project, especially if it's, a developer's first time going into this path.
I mean, Heather is completely correct. And the one thing I will say that I really enjoy about people in the affordable housing sector is that we don't hold on to all of this as like this precious IP. We're here, we're talking about it, we're talking about our failures, we're talking about our successes in the hopes that somebody else can build on that and do a better job. And then we in turn can learn from them. So if you're not in the affordable housing sector, tie into someone who's in the affordable housing sector that has done this and and then you can directly benefit from the lessons they've learned.
That is fantastic advice, and one of the great things I've noticed about this community is how everyone's very willing to share. Shefali, Heather, thank you so much for being guests on the podcast. Yeah, this was such a great conversation, and hopefully we get to do this again.
And that was a great conversation there, Jay, with Heather and Shefali. What were the highlights for you?
Oh man, there were a lot. As you said earlier, it's just always really fun to hear what's going on in New York City, and Dattner's done so many great projects up there. And I was just, yeah, I don't know. One of the things that really has always struck me about Dattner is that they're the ones who introduced me to the idea of just when you build densely, passive house makes so much more sense. And
Hmm.
how it's not, you still have to do air sealing well, and you still have to insulate a little bit and high performance windows and everything. But, it's you don't have to do that much more. And I think that they've always been one of the firms that has kind of, had that great message about how you just have to build a little bit better. It's not going to break the bank. They introduced me to the idea of just how much Passive House helps with, I guess, like sound. So
Yeah.
specifically 425 Grand Concourse. I wrote about that project maybe 4 years ago, and that's the first time I saw this heat map that Christoph Stumpf showed, where it's like you've got 425 Grand Concourse in the South Bronx, and you've got airlines going over it. You've got every rail tunnel coming from north goes right past it. You've got several interstates, and just between the noise pollution, the air pollution, it's just really bad for folks. You have high asthma
Yeah.
rates, noise can bother them. And Passive House solves that.
Yeah.
Between the making it airtight with the mechanical ventilation that helps with the air quality, and then with the triple pane windows that makes it a lot quieter. So that's all of that kind of like revelation happened because of Dattner. So it was really cool to kind of expand upon that and actually talk with Shefali and Heather about it.
Just picking up on that point, because I think that's a really interesting point about challenging sites still being able to be healthy and desirable
Yeah.
if there's a passive house there. And I experienced that with, I think it was in Houston, where we went to visit a passive house building that was it was a shelter basically, and bus pulled up and we went inside, had a look around. It was amazing. It wasn't until we got outside that we realized, and that was pointed out to us, that there was a major overpass pretty much running along the back side of that site. And that's partly why it was able to be purchased and it was affordable. But we didn't realize that when we were inside, because the acoustic insulation was so good, and yet it felt airy and light and well ventilated. And that just opens up a lot of these more challenging sites to still being able to be a desirable place to live, providing you have that really good enclosure.
Yeah. I'm actually thinking of really, there's a really great picture from an article about Vienna House up in BC. Picture is like people working on the facade, and literally there's a train whipping by them like 10
Yeah.
feet away. And then this is gonna, no one's gonna hear that. I mean, they can if they want to open up their window, but like they're not gonna be
Yeah.
subject to that noise pollution all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Zach, what are your thoughts?
Well, jumping off from that impact of Passive House on where you can build, I think that there were a couple of cool connections between Passive House and better design. So I think I would put that one in the classification of better urban design, not having these vacant lots that are vacant because nobody wants to be building in a noisy or bad air quality spot, and Passive House can mitigate that. But another one was this idea that the better Passive House, particularly Passive House for buildings that have a good form factor, so it's the combination there, allows for the higher window to wall ratio and better access to light. That's something that, being in Seattle in the winter, I'm thinking about all the time. And I love seeing examples where, and they abound, where Passive House can be aligned with just better design. I mean, I think Michael Ingwe talks about that a lot in his really gorgeous retrofits of Brooklyn brownstones, where because it's Passive House, you don't have a bunch of space taken up with like radiators, and you can be comfortable all the way up to the window. All of those, there are these uncelebrated sometimes benefits of better building that don't really have anything to do with energy. Well, they're related to energy efficiency, but they're not. That's not the key thing. They just make life better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I really like that emphasis at the beginning about healthy and desirable. There wasn't really any discussion, but did go on to this interesting discussion around PV and versus green roofs, Jay, which I think is, and you asked some interesting questions about, building integrated PVs and sort of where technology's going in that direction. Sounds like some potentially interesting challenges and opportunities for what you do on the outside of buildings.
Yeah. And I kept wanting to I kept mistaking Dattner and MAP, which luckily I didn't actually say anything, but in my head I was thinking that because there's this project in East Harlem that MAP is doing where they're incorporating the photovoltaics. And yeah, it's really fascinating to hear how that technology is kind of advancing, because I don't know, I haven't seen much of it anywhere. So
yeah. I mean, I guess the interesting question around servicing and durability and lifespan, when we're talking about buildings that we're intending to be there for 50, 100 years, and some of these things we've been told they're only really useful for 20 years, but you also have to clean them, and there's other, changing technology. You're probably going to want to change these things out within that time frame. So there's a few things to be sorted out there. I'd be cautious of designing my building around something that relies on something that's available today, because that technology is still going to progress. So I think there are better solutions around allowing for systems that can be updated as that progression happens, and things like thin film PV, and there's some pretty exciting developments in that space. But I think there's some other interesting issues around larger apartment buildings and where you have generation, and then who looks after that, and who gets to benefit from that when it's not going to cover all of the energy use in the building. But all that stuff is getting thought about and worked out, which I think is pretty exciting. I guess just to wrap it up, a couple of things from me. I really like that pointing out the value of certification and recognizing that it is a cost, but it's such an important piece of the puzzle, not just to design to sort of some opaque standards or principles, but to actually certify is the one way to verify the quality of your work and that of the contractors. And I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle. And then also getting that feedback from real life buildings and feeding that information back into the modeling and improving the design process, I think is a really valuable piece of design work. But it's also something that we can do more and more of now that there are more of these buildings. We can actually see what's working and what's not, particularly when it comes to keeping cool, which is, it just keeps on coming up, and it's going to keep on coming up. We've kind of fixed the issue of keeping people warm in winter, more or less. But what we need to be thinking about more and more is how we keep people cool in summertime as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't particularly for New York, but for Maine and probably Zach, your neck of the woods, that 15 years ago AC was kind of optional,
Yeah.
and no longer is. Like
Yeah.
you absolutely have to design with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you very much, Jay. And of course, the team at Dattner Architects do some fantastic work and really leading the charge there in New York and elsewhere. Thanks for that, Jay. I look forward to more of your great interviews coming up. But in the meantime, Zach, what else have we got going on over at the Accelerator?
Yeah, well, the main thing that we want to flag for everyone is our very exciting Reimagine Buildings multifamily virtual conference that's on March 12th. And it's going to be a 4-hour conference full of real projects and insights and lessons learned from those projects. And we're bringing together the practitioners, owners, and researchers who are pushing comfortable, resilient, climate-ready housing from vision to reality. So it's a really great lineup of speakers that our producer, Kim Davis, has put together. If you are curious and want to see that lineup, please visit the passivehouseaccelerator.com website, and you'll see a banner at the top that links you to information, and we'd love to see you there. And registration to the conference also entitles you to 1 free month of membership in the Reimagine Buildings Collective. So it's a really great value.
Yeah, that's a bargain. Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you, Jay. And we'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.